Right now, most of Georgia is sitting under a first alert weather day for dangerous heat, but meteorologists are warning that the exact same air mass baking the state today is about to snap into something far more violent within 24 hours, a shift that catches even longtime Georgia residents off guard every single summer. Damaging wind gusts, frequent lightning, flash flooding, and it's all being triggered by the very heat that's making everyone miserable outside right now, a chain reaction most people never see coming until it's already overhead. This is the moment where a heat wave stops being just uncomfortable and starts becoming genuinely dangerous in a completely different way. And understanding why can help you actually prepare for it instead of getting caught off guard. Here's exactly what's unfolding across the state. On July 28th, Albany and much of South Georgia were placed under a first alert weather day, specifically for dangerous heat, running from noon until 8 p.m., with highs pushing near 100 degrees and heat index values climbing close to 110. That kind of heat alone would be enough to warrant serious caution, but forecasters immediately followed it with a second alert for the very next day, this time for strong afternoon storms expected to break the intense heat wide open. The Storm Prediction Center placed a marginal to slight risk of severe storms across the region from 2 p.m. to 8 p.m., with the damaging wind threat reaching as high as 15% along Highway 319 and Highway 82 southeast, and a lower but still present 5% risk elsewhere, paired with a genuine flash flooding concern. To understand why a heat wave this intense almost always ends in violent storms, you have to understand what's actually happening in the atmosphere above Georgia right now. When the ground heats up as dramatically as it has this week, with highs running well above seasonal norms day after day, that heat doesn't just sit there quietly, it rises. As hot, humid air near the surface climbs into the atmosphere, it eventually collides with cooler air aloft, creating exactly the kind of instability that fuels thunderstorm development. Add in a passing front or a shift in wind patterns, and that built-up energy gets released all at once, often in the form of fast-moving storms capable of producing damaging straight-line winds, frequent lightning, and torrential rainfall in a very short window. Meteorologists sometimes describe this pattern using the phrase breaking the heat, because that's essentially what's happening physically. The atmosphere is discharging days' worth of accumulated thermal energy in a single volatile burst. This week's pattern across North Georgia has followed almost the exact same script on repeat. On July 27th, meteorologists in Atlanta labeled the day a first alert weather day for major heat, with highs reaching the upper 90s and heat index values climbing back above 100 degrees for hours at a stretch, officially the peak of the week's heat threat. A heat advisory covered nearly the entirety of North Georgia from noon until 8 p.m., excluding only the higher elevations where slightly cooler air offered marginal relief. And just like the pattern playing out in South Georgia, forecasters immediately flagged storms as possible the very next afternoon after 3 p.m., a near-identical setup of extreme heat followed by a storm trigger less than 24 hours later. Earlier, in the same stretch on July 3rd, meteorologists described nearly identical conditions heading into the July 4th holiday weekend, with a heat advisory in effect across most of North Georgia, and afternoon heat index values expected to exceed 105 degrees. Overnight temperatures barely dropped, staying near or above 80 degrees, even after sunset, denying residents any real relief before the next scorching day began. Layered directly on top of that heat threat, forecasters warned of strong to severe storms developing across portions of North Georgia that same evening, with damaging wind gusts, small hail, frequent lightning, and heavy rain all considered likely. The Storm Prediction Center placed the area north of Interstate 85 under a marginal risk for severe weather that same afternoon and evening, essentially the same heat, then storm sequence playing out yet again, just 3.5 weeks earlier in the summer. What makes this pattern particularly tricky for residents is the whiplash between two completely different kinds of danger, occurring within the same 24 to 48-hour window. During the heat phase, the primary threats are heat exhaustion and heat stroke, conditions that develop gradually through prolonged exposure and dehydration. But once storms fire up, the danger profile flips almost instantly to fast-moving, high-impact hazards, damaging straight-line winds capable of snapping tree limbs and knocking down power lines, sudden and intense lightning strikes, and localized flash flooding that can turn low-lying roads into hazardous conditions within minutes. Emergency officials note that this rapid transition catches people off guard more often than a single sustained threat would, because residents who spent the entire day taking heat precautions sometimes let their guard down right as the more immediate storm danger arrives. One particularly striking example unfolded across eastern Georgia earlier this month, when the National Weather Service warned of what officials described as a double threat hitting the state on the same day: Afternoon thunderstorms capable of damaging winds paired directly with a heat index reaching as high as 108 degrees in some areas, a combination officials called one of the more dangerous setups they track all season. Madison, in east central Georgia, was projected to see the worst combination of both hazards, with heat readings between 105 and 110 degrees. Athens, Dublin, and Vidalia were each expected to reach roughly 105 degrees, while Atlanta itself sat slightly cooler in the 95 to 100 degree range. Northeast Georgia carried the greatest storm. Risk that particular day, with the National Weather Service noting the biggest dangers were damaging wind gusts, frequent lightning, and heavy rain arriving in short, intense bursts rather than a steady, prolonged downpour. Georgia's weather pattern this summer has essentially been locked into a repeating cycle. Several consecutive days of building, dangerous heat, followed by a sharp release valve in the form of strong to severe afternoon and evening storms, only for the heat to rebuild again within a day or two once the storms clear out and sunshine returns. Earlier in July, South Georgia experienced a version of this same cycle play out over an entire week, with a stretch of intense heat that included highs in the mid to upper 90s and isolated storms capable of producing damaging winds up to 60 miles per hour. That particular heat wave was eventually broken by a more sustained stretch of widespread showers and storms that rolled through over several consecutive days, delivering as much as 1 to 2 inches of rainfall region-wide and easing temperatures back down into the upper 80s before the cycle inevitably started building toward heat once again. Georgia's power grid operators are watching this repeating heat and storm cycle just as closely as meteorologists are, because the two threats stress the electrical system in completely opposite ways. During the heat phase, demand spikes dramatically as millions of residents run air conditioning at maximum capacity for hours on end, pushing the grid close to its peak summer capacity on the hottest afternoons. Then, almost immediately afterward, severe storms roll through with damaging straight-line winds strong enough to snap tree limbs onto power lines, triggering scattered outages at the exact moment demand is already elevated from the preceding heat. Utility crews across the state have described this pattern as one of the most challenging combinations they deal with each summer, since restoring power after storm damage becomes significantly more urgent when the outage coincides with dangerously high heat index values rather than milder weather. Agriculture across Georgia, one of the state's largest industries, is also caught squarely in the middle of this cycle. Farmers harvesting summer crops have to work around both halves of the pattern, adjusting schedules to avoid the most dangerous heat hours while also watching storm forecasts closely enough to protect equipment and livestock from sudden severe weather. Peach and cotton growers in particular have reported mixed outcomes from this pattern this season, since the intense heat can stress crops during the day, while the follow-up storms deliver much-needed rainfall, but occasionally arrive with enough damaging wind to cause physical crop damage in the process. Livestock producers face a similar balancing act, needing to keep animals cool and hydrated during extended heat stretches while also securing shelters ahead of storms capable of producing hail and wind gusts strong enough to cause real structural damage to barns and fencing. School districts across affected counties have also had to adapt to the same whiplash pattern in real time. Outdoor athletic practices, particularly for fall sports teams, beginning preseason conditioning in the middle of summer, have repeatedly been shifted indoors or rescheduled entirely around both the peak heat windows and the incoming storm threats. Coaches and athletic trainers have leaned heavily on wet bulb globe temperature readings, a more precise heat stress measurement than the standard heat index, to determine when outdoor activity becomes unsafe, often making the call to move indoors well before official heat. Advisories technically take effect. That same coordination extends to storm timing, with practices sometimes cut short entirely when lightning becomes detectable within a certain radius, regardless of how far away the actual storm cell appears to be. Emergency management officials across Georgia's most frequently affected counties have started treating this heat-then-storm sequence as its own distinct hazard pattern rather than two separate, unrelated weather events, adjusting their entire public communication strategy around that recognition. Coordinated alert systems now frequently combine heat advisory and severe storm messaging into a single daily briefing, specifically so residents understand they need to prepare for both hazards within the same short window rather than assuming the danger passes once the heat portion of the day ends. This shift in messaging reflects a broader recognition that public safety communication needs to keep pace with how these patterns are actually behaving on the ground, rather than treating heat and severe weather as isolated sequential concerns. If you want to stay ahead of pattern shifts like this one before they hit your area, go ahead and like this video and subscribe, because Georgia's weather has been anything but predictable this summer and we're tracking every twist as it develops. For residents trying to navigate this kind of rapid-fire weather whiplash, officials are offering some fairly consistent guidance regardless of which phase of the cycle you're currently in. During the heat portion, limit outdoor activity during peak hours, typically between 2 p.m. and 6 p.m. Stay well hydrated throughout the entire day, rather than only when you start feeling thirsty. And check in regularly on elderly neighbors, young children, and pets, all of whom face elevated risk during extended heat exposure. Once storms begin developing, the advice shifts fast. Get indoors before the first rumble of thunder rather than waiting for visible lightning. Avoid using corded electronics or plumbing during active storms. And steer clear of flood-prone roads entirely rather than attempting to drive through standing water, since it takes surprisingly little moving water to sweep a vehicle off the road. Looking ahead, forecasters are cautiously optimistic that a more sustained pattern change could be on the way, and this time it may involve a genuine cold front rather than just another isolated round of afternoon storms. Some models suggest late week. Conditions may trend more seasonable, with drier air moving in behind this latest storm cycle, offering Georgia residents a genuine, if temporary, break from the extreme heat that's defined much of the summer so far. Weekend forecasts point toward a wetter and cooler setup as a stalled front interacts with low-pressure tracking through the region, potentially delivering another round of heavier rainfall even as temperatures ease. Meteorologists caution that even a meaningful cool down of 5 to 10 degrees would still leave highs in the upper 80s to low 90s across most of the state, hardly a true escape from summer heat, but enough of a shift to reduce the extreme risk currently driving the daily heat advisories and warnings. But if this summer's pattern has proven anything so far, it's that any break from the heat in Georgia tends to be temporary rather than permanent, and residents should expect this cycle of building heat followed by sudden severe storms to keep repeating well into the later weeks of summer.